New York, early 1950s. In a quiet neighborhood of Queens, among rows of red brick houses built with the precision of giant toy blocks, lived a boy who was impossible to ignore. His name was Donald John Trump, the fourth of 5 children born to Fred and Mary Ann Trump. From the beginning, Donald was different. He was loud, restless, and hard to contain. While other kids played by the rules, Donald made his own. If there was a game, he had to win it. If he couldn't win, he'd find a way to change the rules. Losing to him was unthinkable. His father, Fred Trump, a German-American real estate developer, was a man of discipline and precision. He believed in control, efficiency, and hard work. Fred didn't talk about emotions. He built buildings, not sentiments. Yet to young Donald, his father represented power. A man who always stood tall, who never let the world push him around. At the dinner table, Fred's lessons were simple and direct. You're either on top or you're underneath. Never be the one on the bottom. Mary Ann, Donald's mother, was softer, a Scottish immigrant who brought warmth into the cold symmetry of the Trump household. She was patient, gentle, and kind, but even she often found herself exhausted by her son's unstoppable energy. "Donald has the energy of 5 boys rolled into one," she once said, half joking, half pleading. At school, Donald wasn't a model student. He was clever but impulsive. Teachers complained that he talked too much, questioned authority too often, and refused to back down. Punishment didn't faze him. What scared him was being ordinary. When Donald turned 13, his parents made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. They sent him to New York Military Academy, NYMA, a strict boarding school designed to impose order on rebellious boys. They hoped it would calm him down. Instead, it forged him. The first morning at NYMA began with a blaring bugle at 5 a.m. The cold bit at his skin, and his uniform hung loosely on his thin frame. Around him other boys muttered, complained, even cried. Donald didn't. He watched, he adapted, and soon he began to lead. In a place where obedience was mandatory, Donald discovered something unexpected. Leadership wasn't given, it was taken. He wasn't the strongest or the smartest, but he was the most determined. Within months, he climbed the ranks, earning respect from cadets and officers alike. One of his classmates would later recall, "Donald always wanted things his way, but somehow he made you believe it was your idea too." NYMA taught him discipline and endurance, but more importantly, it taught him how to command attention. When others sought approval, Donald sought recognition. He wasn't satisfied with praise. He wanted proof. Each night, after drills and study hours, he'd sit by his dorm window, looking out toward the distant glow of Manhattan. To most boys, it was just a skyline. To Donald, it was a promise. Somewhere beyond those lights were men who ruled the world. Men who built empires and shaped the city's fate. He didn't know how, but he knew one day he would join them. As he grew older, Donald began to understand his father more deeply. Fred Trump didn't hug his children, but his rare nod of approval meant more than 100 words. "Good job, son," he'd say curtly, and for Donald, that was enough. During school breaks, Fred would take Donald to his construction sites across Brooklyn and Queens. Together, they'd inspect materials, talk to contractors, and check on tenants. Donald learned the business not from books, but from the smell of concrete and the rhythm of hammering steel. He watched his father negotiate. Calm, deliberate, unemotional, Fred taught him how to measure risk, how to calculate profit, and how to spot weakness in others. "Look past the paint, son," Fred once told him while inspecting an apartment complex. "Don't see what it is, see what it could be." That phrase stuck with him. Most boys his age dreamed of baseball or rock and roll. Donald dreamed of square footage, property lines, and profit margins. One summer, standing on the roof of a half-finished building, Fred pointed toward the shimmering skyline of Manhattan. "See that?" he asked. "Yes, that's another world. If you're smart, you'll stay on this side of the river." "And if I'm brave?" Donald asked. Fred didn't answer. He didn't need to. For Donald, Manhattan wasn't just a cluster of tall buildings. It was the ultimate prize. The city across the river called to him like a challenge. By 1964, Donald graduated from NYMA as one of its standout cadets, taller, calmer, sharper, but still fiercely competitive. Most of his classmates would go on to become lawyers, engineers, or soldiers. Donald knew his path would be different. He joined his father's company, Elizabeth Trump and Son, a modest but successful real estate firm. Yet from the moment he stepped into the office, he felt constrained. The projects were small, the clients unremarkable, the ambition too tame. When friends asked what he wanted, Donald didn't hesitate. "My father builds for the working class," he said. "I'll build for the people they dream of becoming." That statement, bold and almost arrogant, marked the beginning of his divergence. The line between the world he was born into and the empire he intended to create. Beyond the bridges of Queens lay Manhattan, gleaming like a promise he intended to keep. And for the young Donald Trump, that was where the real story would begin. Working at his father's company was Donald Trump's first real taste of the world beyond classrooms and drills. It didn't take him long to realize that business was nothing like military school. At no IMA, the rules were clear, orders absolute. In real estate, there were no rules, only timing, instinct, and nerve. Fred Trump's way was conservative. He built rows of practical apartment complexes in Brooklyn and Queens, serving middle-income tenants. His projects were reliable, unglamorous, and steady. For Fred, stability was success. Attention was a distraction. For Donald, it was the opposite. To him, attention was currency, and image was part of the game. During those early years, Donald followed his father through construction sites. Listening quietly as Fred discussed financing and permits with city officials, he absorbed every detail, the negotiations, the tension, the way Fred's silence could make others talk too much. Fred was deliberate, unflinching, never in a hurry. Donald respected that, but somewhere inside he was already questioning it. He noticed that while his father spoke softly behind closed doors, other developers downtown had their names glowing across Manhattan's skyline. Fred was successful, yes, but invisible. Donald wanted more than success. He wanted recognition. The education of a visionary Donald began college at Fordham University, but after 2 years, he transferred to the Wharton School of Finance at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the most competitive business schools in the country. Wharton changed him. It wasn't just about grades, it was about survival among the ambitious. He studied real estate finance, marketing, and management. But the real lesson came from observation. He noticed that business wasn't only numbers, it was narrative. A deal wasn't just profitable because of what it was worth, but because of what people believed it was worth. In one of his term papers, Donald wrote a sentence that would foreshadow his future. "Perception creates value faster than construction does." That belief became the cornerstone of his approach to everything: real estate, branding, and eventually, politics. By the time he graduated in 1968, Donald was no longer the restless boy from Queens. He had learned the language of money and influence, and he was eager to use it. He returned to his father's office with a degree in hand and a plan already forming in his mind. Back to business, Fred welcomed him home with quiet pride, but there was no ceremony. He simply handed Donald a stack of project files. "Start here," he said. Donald did. He managed small developments, collected rent, dealt with contractors, and fielded complaints from tenants. But every evening, when the office emptied, he'd stand by the window and stare at the faint outline of Manhattan's skyline. That skyline haunted him. It was close enough to see, far enough to taunt. One evening, Donald spoke up during dinner. "Dad, we're doing fine here, but this isn't the whole picture. The city's changing. Queens and Brooklyn are safe, but Manhattan, that's where the future is." Fred frowned. "Manhattan's for gamblers. You don't build there, you survive there." Donald smiled slightly. "Then I'll survive better than they do." Fred didn't argue further, but the conversation marked the invisible border between father and son, between prudence and ambition. The first lessons of the marketplace. By the late 1960s, New York was in trouble. Crime was rising, the economy slowing, and once grand buildings stood half empty. To most investors, it looked like a dying city. To Donald, it looked like an opening. He began studying abandoned properties, city auctions, and stalled construction sites. His father thought it was a waste of time, but Donald sensed that the city would recover. And when it did, whoever had planted their flag early would own the skyline. He wasn't always right. Some deals fell apart. Banks refused loans. Bureaucrats dismissed him as a brash kid playing tycoon. Yet every rejection only sharpened his instincts. A former colleague later said, "Donald never admitted mistakes. He'd just say, 'Next time, I'll do it differently.'" And somehow, he always did. He learned how to navigate government incentives, court publicity, and, most importantly, sell confidence. To Donald, confidence was capital. If he believed hard enough, others would too. Beyond the shadow. The tension with his father remained quiet but steady. Fred admired Donald's drive but distrusted his appetite for risk. Donald admired Fred's discipline but saw it as a cage. They respected each other, but neither would bend. One night, as they locked up the office, Donald asked, "Dad, do you ever regret not crossing the river?" Fred looked at him. "No, I built a life that lasts. I didn't need the spotlight." Donald nodded. "Maybe not, but some of us are built for the spotlight." Fred smiled faintly. "Then you'd better make sure it doesn't burn you." The words stayed with Donald, but so did the glow of Manhattan's lights reflected in his father's car window as they drove home. He knew his time was coming. The turning point in 1971. At just 25, Donald Trump took over most of the family's operations and renamed the business the Trump Organization. It was more than a rebranding. It was a declaration of independence. He wanted his name, not his father's, to stand for something bigger, louder, riskier. Fred had built homes for the working class. Donald would build monuments to aspiration. He started small, but his gaze was fixed firmly across the river. To him, Manhattan was no longer the unreachable dream of a boy at military school. It was a target within sight. That night, alone in his small Upper East Side apartment, Donald stood by the window and looked out over the city that never slept. The lights shimmered like 1,000 possibilities. He remembered his father's words. "Only those unafraid of risk cross into Manhattan." Donald whispered to himself, barely audible. "Then I'm already halfway there." And with that, he turned from the window, already planning the empire he would build. One deal, one building, one headline at a time. By 1971, Donald Trump had taken a bold step that many in New York's real estate circles found presumptuous. He rebranded his father's modest company as the Trump Organization. To Fred Trump, the change was cosmetic. To Donald, it was symbolic. The new name represented his independence, his appetite for risk, and his intent to move beyond the predictable suburbs of Brooklyn and Queens. While Fred focused on steady returns, Donald set his sights on Manhattan, the gleaming heart of ambition. The island was the stage where reputations were built and lost, where one could either rise among skyscrapers or disappear in their shadows. His father warned him that Manhattan was a playground for gamblers, but Donald saw it differently. "It's not gambling," he told a friend. "It's strategy. You just have to know when the odds are in your favor." The city of opportunity, in the early 1970s, Manhattan wasn't the glittering paradise it appeared to be from afar. Crime rates were soaring, the economy was faltering, and once luxurious hotels stood half empty. Many saw decline. Donald saw potential. "The city's at its lowest," he once remarked, "which means everything's on sale." He began attending city planning meetings, studying abandoned properties, and searching for a foothold. It came in the form of the Commodore Hotel, a grand but decaying building near Grand Central Terminal. Once a hub of luxury, it had become a symbol of urban decay, and an opportunity few dared to touch. To pursue the project, Donald knew he needed more than vision. He needed connections. He started networking relentlessly, attending charity galas, political fundraisers, and business luncheons. His charisma, equal parts confidence and showmanship, caught the attention of powerful figures, among them Manhattan's mayor, Abe Beame, who had known Fred Trump for years. Using that connection, Donald negotiated a deal that would later become one of the most innovative public-private partnerships in New York City history. The idea was simple but bold. The city would give him major tax breaks if he could bring in an investor to revive the Commodore. The first big gamble Donald found his partner in Hyatt Hotels, a company looking to establish a presence in New York. It wasn't an easy sell. Hyatt's executives were skeptical about investing in a city many had written off. But Donald pitched them not just a hotel, he sold them a vision. He described the rebirth of Grand Central, the return of tourism, the comeback of New York as a symbol of resilience. After months of meetings and negotiations, the deal went through. In 1976, the Trump Organization officially began work on what would become the Grand Hyatt Hotel. Donald was 30 years old. The project was a logistical nightmare, old infrastructure, union disputes, and endless bureaucratic red tape. But Donald thrived in the chaos. He personally reviewed architectural plans, pushed contractors to stay on schedule, and micromanaged every detail from marble selection to signage font. He was, as one architect put it, relentless to the point of exhaustion. But behind that intensity was strategy. Donald knew that every challenge he overcame added to his legend. He cultivated relationships with journalists, inviting them to the site, feeding them progress updates, and hinting that something extraordinary was taking shape on 42nd Street. From vision to reality, when the Grand Hyatt finally opened in 1980, it wasn't just a new hotel, it was a statement. Wrapped in glass and lit with golden hues, it gleamed like a symbol of New York's revival. Donald stood at the grand opening in his tailored suit, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, and letting his name bask in the reflected glow. To many, he was still Fred Trump's son. But that night, under the flash of cameras and the applause of city officials, Donald crossed an invisible threshold. He had stepped into his own narrative. In the months that followed, the Grand Hyatt became a success, both financially and symbolically. The press hailed Donald as the comeback kid of New York real estate. Newspapers wrote about his charm, his ambition, and his daring optimism at a time when the city itself was uncertain of its future. He read every article, underlined every mention of his name, and filed them carefully. It wasn't vanity, it was record-keeping. Donald understood something instinctively. Public perception builds momentum. The more people believed in his success, the more success he could attract. That year, standing on the hotel's rooftop one evening, Donald looked toward the skyline. Beyond the shimmering lights of Midtown stood a plot of land that had long captured his imagination, a stretch of Fifth Avenue that cried out for something grander than a hotel. He envisioned a tower of glass, steel, and gold that would bear his name and dominate the city's silhouette. He didn't yet know when or how, but one thought burned in his mind. If I can build here, I can build anywhere. And in that thought, the seed of Trump Tower was planted. The Grand Hyatt had changed everything. Overnight, Donald Trump went from an ambitious son of a Queens builder to one of New York's most talked-about developers. The headlines praised his confidence, the deal-making ingenuity, the gleaming glass facade that reflected a city beginning to believe in itself again. But for Donald, success was never a destination. It was a platform. While the ink on the Hyatt contracts was barely dry, he had already moved on to a new question. What next? He had tasted recognition, and it wasn't enough. He wanted permanence, a monument that would make the Trump name inseparable from the Manhattan skyline. That monument would be Trump Tower, dreaming in glass and gold. The idea took shape around 1979, when Donald learned that a department store company, Bonwit Teller, was preparing to vacate its property at 725 Fifth Avenue. The location was priceless. The corner of 5th and 56th Street, surrounded by the giants of commerce and culture. Where others saw the burden of demolishing an old building, Donald saw an opportunity to stake his claim in the most exclusive stretch of real estate in America. He imagined a tower of mirrored glass, shimmering like a vertical sunrise over Midtown. Not just an office building, but a statement of intent. Inside would be luxury residences, retail space, and an atrium open to the public, a mixture of opulence and accessibility that mirrored Donald's own view of success. To make it happen, he would need approvals, financing, and partners, none of which came easily. The city was still wary of extravagant developments. Banks were cautious, and preservationists protested the planned demolition of Bonwit. Teller's ornate Art Deco sculptures, Donald met each challenge, with the same mixture of calculation and defiance that had carried him through military school and business school alike. To investors, he spoke of profitability, to the media of architectural beauty, to the public of jobs and opportunity. Every audience heard what they needed to hear. "I'm building something New York can be proud of," he told a reporter. "And if I'm proud of it too, that's not such a bad thing." Building the symbol construction began in 1980. The site became a frenzy of machinery and concrete, a symphony of ambition. Donald visited daily, wearing a hard hat, inspecting steel beams, adjusting schedules, challenging engineers to shave off days without compromising quality. He was not an architect, but he understood performance. And every visit to the site was part inspection, part theatre. To some, he was overbearing. To others, he was electrifying. His energy was contagious, his certainty disarming. He could turn skepticism into belief through sheer persistence. When the golden glass facade began to rise, reflecting the clouds and the motion of Fifth Avenue, passers-by stopped to stare. The press, ever hungry for spectacle, began calling it Trump's Tower, long before the name was official. Donald did nothing to correct them. Inside, he planned marble interiors, cascading waterfalls, and a grand atrium that would be open to the public. A space designed as much for awe as for foot traffic. He spared little expense but demanded perfection. If a column was off by half an inch, he noticed. If a colour felt dull under fluorescent light, he replaced it. By 1983, Trump Tower was complete. The opening was a media event. Celebrities, bankers, politicians, and reporters crowded into the gleaming atrium. Cameras flashed as Donald stood before the towering waterfall, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had turned imagination into stone and steel. For the first time, his name was the building, literally cast in bronze above the entrance, visible to millions who walked down Fifth Avenue. It was more than branding. It was identity. The making of a persona Trump Tower was an instant commercial success, but its greater achievement was intangible. It turned Donald Trump himself into a brand. He gave interviews in his office on the 26th floor, surrounded by gold trim and framed magazine covers. The press found him irresistible, a man who mixed the blunt talk of a builder with the polish of a showman. He spoke openly about money, fame, and winning, subjects most businessmen handled with caution. His directness, whether admired or criticized, made him impossible to ignore. "People don't root for modesty," he told a journalist. "They root for confidence." He began appearing on talk shows, attending premieres, and showing up in gossip columns. His marriage to Ivana Zelničková, a glamorous former skier from Czechoslovakia, only fueled the fascination. Together, they embodied a new kind of 1980s power couple, ambitious, photogenic, and unapologetically driven. To some, Donald was the face of excess. To others, he was proof that the American dream was alive. To himself, he was simply following the same instinct that had guided him since childhood. Never accept limits. The threshold of an era, by the mid-1980s, Donald Trump's world had expanded beyond real estate. He was negotiating casino deals in Atlantic City, considering projects in Florida and California, and buying yachts and airlines as easily as other people bought cars. Each move seemed bigger than the last, but behind it all lay the same engine, the restless need to build, to prove, to win. Standing one evening on his office balcony, he looked down Fifth Avenue as twilight settled over the city. Below him, taxis moved like golden veins through the heart of Manhattan. It had been barely a decade since he'd renamed his father's company, yet here he was, master of his own tower, the city at his feet. He thought of the boy at New York Military Academy, staring through the dorm window bars at this very skyline. Somewhere between that boy and this man stretched a single unbroken line of ambition. "The view's different when you build the window yourself," he murmured. The city lights glimmered on the glass, each reflection a reminder that every dream, once unreachable, begins as a decision to try. By the mid-1980s, Donald Trump had become more than a developer. He was a phenomenon. The success of Trump Tower had transformed him into a celebrity businessman, a new kind of American archetype who mixed the instincts of a builder with the flair of a performer. His name had turned into shorthand for ambition itself. New York was roaring again. The markets were booming, optimism was everywhere, and skyscrapers gleamed like trophies. For Donald, it was the perfect moment to expand. He saw opportunity not only in buildings, but in symbols: casinos, hotels, sports teams, and air travel. If it glittered, he wanted it to bear his name. The casino gamble in 1984. Donald turned his eyes toward Atlantic City, a coastal town that had legalized gambling in hopes of reviving its faded boardwalk glory. To most Wall Street investors, the city was risky. To Donald, it was unfinished business. He envisioned a new Las Vegas on the East Coast, and he wanted to be its king. He acquired a partially built property and opened the Trump Plaza Hotel and Casino. Marble floors, chandeliers, gold accents, luxury by design, excess by intention. It was the embodiment of his belief that people didn't just want to win money, they wanted to feel like winners. The crowds came, the profits followed, and Donald doubled down. Within a few years, he built or acquired two more: Trump's Castle And the Taj Mahal, a colossal $1 billion project he declared would be the eighth wonder of the world. He loved the spectacle. Helicopters ferried him between New York and Atlantic City. Reporters chronicled every deal, every quote, every triumph. On magazine covers, he appeared not as a developer, but as a brand of power itself, confident, controversial, unstoppable. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Each project was heavily financed, built on layers of loans and high interest rates. Success fed ambition. Ambition demanded more debt. To Donald, risk was just another word for confidence, and confidence was his most abundant resource. The media machine. The 1980s adored Donald Trump because he was exactly what the decade wanted to see. Wealth without apology, confidence without restraint. He appeared at charity galas, boxing matches and nightclubs. He bought a yacht, an airline, and the New Jersey Generals football team. He moved through New York society with a showman's precision, aware that every flashbulb was free advertising. But his greatest tool wasn't his fortune. It was his mastery of narrative. He fed journalists with quotes, cultivated rivalries, and turned his life into a running headline. Every deal, every rumor, every romance became part of the Trump mythology. You have to think big, he told a reporter. If you're going to think anyway, you might as well think big. That sentence became a mantra. His relationship with Ivana Trump added glamour to the empire. She wasn't just his wife. She was an executive, managing the Plaza Hotel and helping oversee design projects. Together they were photographed skiing, hosting galas, smiling beneath chandeliers. A modern-day power couple embodying wealth, drive, and publicity. But fame, like credit, carried interest. Every success raised expectations. Every delay or rumor of debt became front-page news. For the first time, Donald began to sense that the spotlight he had built could also turn harsh. The peak of the empire in 1988, he acquired the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, a crown jewel of New York elegance. The purchase was as much emotional as strategic. It's a masterpiece, he said, and every masterpiece deserves a signature. By now, his empire stretched from casinos to condominiums, from television deals to golf courses. He had become, in his own words, the embodiment of success. Yet his days were filled with endless phone calls, urgent meetings, and negotiations with banks. Behind the confident quotes lay spreadsheets of mounting liabilities. Friends noticed he rarely rested. Donald never pauses, one associate recalled. He's always chasing the next thing. He doesn't celebrate, he calculates. And calculation was becoming harder. The American economy was cooling. Lenders were tightening credit. Real estate values were slipping. The world that had rewarded boldness was about to start punishing it. Still, Donald refused to slow down. Momentum, he often said, is everything. Once you stop moving, you start falling. He didn't yet know that momentum could cut both ways. By the close of the 1980s, Donald Trump stood at the summit of his empire. He owned hotels, casinos, airlines, a football team, and the Plaza, his beloved trophy. His face appeared regularly on magazine covers. His quotes about success were printed next to those of presidents and film stars. The Trump brand had become a shorthand for luxury, audacity, and relentless motion. But beneath the gleaming surface, a slow pressure was building. The economy was shifting, interest rates were climbing, and the cost of maintaining his empire had become staggering. The very confidence that had carried him upward was now pushing him toward the edge. The unraveling in 1989, the market trembled, stock prices wobbled, real estate values slid, and the easy loans that had fueled the decade dried up almost overnight. For Donald, whose businesses were built on complex webs of debt and personal guarantees, the ripple felt like an earthquake. The numbers were merciless. The Taj Mahal Casino, once hailed as the eighth wonder of the world, opened under a mountain of loans. Interest payments reached into the millions each week. Cash flow from other casinos began to fall. At first, Donald dismissed the warning signs. "We've been through worse," he told reporters. "People forget. I thrive in difficult markets." But behind closed doors, the tone was different. Advisors warned him of looming defaults. Bankers grew impatient. Even the public, once enamored with his bravado, began to whisper about overreach. The press, which had once amplified his every success, now chronicled his setbacks with the same enthusiasm. Headlines that once praised his genius now questioned his solvency. The empire built on boldness, one column read, may be cracking under its own weight. The fall and the reckoning. By 1990, the pressure reached breaking point. The Plaza Hotel was losing money. The airlines couldn't stay afloat. The casinos bled millions. And for the first time in his adult life, Donald Trump faced the possibility of failure on a public scale. His personal debts exceeded hundreds of millions. Rumors of bankruptcy filled the air. The same people who had once lined up to do business with him now kept their distance. Yet even then, he refused to disappear. He met with banks, negotiated new terms, traded assets, and persuaded lenders that a living Trump was worth more than a ruined one. It was, in its way, a second act of showmanship. Less glamorous, more desperate, but equally dramatic. He sold his yacht, his airline, and some properties, consolidating what remained. The banks, calculating that his name still held value, agreed to restructure his debts. He survived, wounded but intact. Looking back years later, he would call it the toughest period of my life. I learned, he said, that sometimes you have to lose to understand how to win again. It wasn't the kind of quote that made headlines in the 1980s, but it marked a change in tone, one born not from triumph, but endurance. The quiet years. Through the early 1990s, Donald kept a lower profile. The man who once lived in front of cameras now worked behind the scenes, rebuilding piece by piece. He refocused on real estate, taking smaller, more calculated risks. Critics predicted his disappearance, but they underestimated his instinct for reinvention. He still had the two things that mattered most, his name and his story. While others saw scandal, he saw narrative, a comeback arc waiting to be written. Slowly, he began to craft that story. New deals followed, new buildings carried his name, and journalists who once chronicled his fall began to speak again of his resilience. By the mid-1990s, the tone around Donald Trump had shifted once more. He was no longer the golden boy of Wall Street, but the survivor, the man who had gone to the brink and returned. It was a quieter fame, tempered by experience, but it laid the groundwork for something even bigger. A glimpse of what's next, late one night. Standing by the window of his office at Trump Tower, he looked out at the city that had both made and nearly broken him. The lights shimmered as they always had, indifferent yet familiar. He thought of all that had changed, the losses, the lessons, the narrow escapes. He also thought of what remained, his will to climb, the unshakable belief that visibility was survival. People think failure ends you, he once said quietly to a friend. But it's only the intermission. And in that pause between the noise of the 1980s and the reinvention of the 1990s, Donald Trump began to plan his next act. The early 1990s had stripped away much of the glitter that once surrounded Donald Trump. The casinos were drowning in debt, the headlines had turned cruel, and the aura of invincibility was gone. For the first time in his life, he was fighting not to win, but to stay afloat. But adversity, for Donald, had always been a kind of oxygen. While others saw the decade as his downfall, he treated it as an opportunity, a forced pause to rebuild his foundation. He began small again, not in scale, but in focus. The Trump Organization, once stretched across airlines, sports, and yachts, turned back to its core, real estate. He renegotiated with banks, restructured debt, and slowly rebuilt his portfolio. The flamboyant tycoon of the 1980s receded, replaced by a quieter, leaner operator. Yet behind the scenes, the same restless ambition churned. Donald understood that his survival now depended on more than money. It depended on image. He had learned painfully that perception could collapse faster than a building, but it could also be rebuilt. A slow rise by the mid-1990s. The American economy was recovering, and Donald rode that wave. He opened new hotels, licensed his name to properties he didn't own, and leveraged the brand that had nearly destroyed him. If he couldn't finance every skyscraper, he could still make them carry his name and get paid for it. It was a subtle but profound shift. Trump was no longer just a developer's signature. It became a symbol, a promise of ambition, luxury, and persistence. He began appearing once again in business magazines, not as the reckless gambler of the 1980s, but as the man who had survived the storm. The tone was different now. Less triumphal, more curious. What drives a man to start over when he's had everything and lost it? One journalist asked. Because, Donald replied, Losing makes winning feel real. A new kind of fame. As the millennium approached, Donald's influence was once again growing, but in a new dimension. The media landscape had changed, television was evolving, and reality was becoming entertainment. Producers began approaching him with ideas for shows about business, leadership, and success. At first he declined. He was still rebuilding, still cautious, but one idea stood out. A show that would put contestants through real business challenges, with Donald himself judging their performance. It would be called The Apprentice. When NBC greenlit the project, many in Hollywood doubted it. Who would watch a businessman fire people on national television? Donald, however, understood something they didn't. People didn't just want entertainment. They wanted a mirror of ambition. Filming began in Trump Tower, the very building that had once defined his ascent. The boardroom scenes were tense, unscripted, and magnetic. Donald played himself, but heightened, the confident, decisive figure who embodied authority. When the first season aired in 2004, it was an instant phenomenon. "You're fired." His signature line entered popular culture almost overnight. The show did more than entertain. It rebuilt his image. Millions of viewers who had never read The Art of the Deal or followed Wall Street now saw Donald Trump as the face of American ambition. To them, he was the mentor, the mogul, the man who knew how to win. The art of reinvention. The Apprentice gave Donald something money couldn't buy: relevance. He had managed, once again, to transform a setback into a stage. The empire of marble and gold had faltered, but the empire of perception had never been stronger. He expanded licensing deals, from hotels to clothing, even bottled water and steaks, all bearing the Trump name. The businessman had become a brand architect, building value out of personality. Critics accused him of turning capitalism into theatre. Admirers saw him as proof that resilience could be glamorous. Donald, for his part, didn't argue with either side. "People can call it whatever they want," he told a reporter. "It works." By the late 2000s, his fortune had recovered. His name was once again synonymous with success, and his fame had surpassed even his 1980s peak. Yet, as before, the spotlight carried a shadow. He was older now, but no less restless. The boardroom had become a stage, and for a man who had mastered reinvention, there was always one stage left to conquer. By the late 2000s, Donald Trump had achieved what few businessmen ever do. He had become both a symbol and a storyline. His image had outgrown the boardroom, his name had outgrown his properties, and his persona had outgrown the city that first defined him. Every week on television, millions watched him stride through the marble halls of Trump Tower, delivering verdicts that blended drama with pragmatism. The Apprentice was not just a show, it was an education in the performance of success. Contestants wanted his approval, audiences studied his tone, and advertisers paid to bask in the glow of his certainty. For Donald, television was more than entertainment. It was a medium of control. The same instincts that once guided him through real estate negotiations now shaped how he presented himself to the world. He understood pacing, suspense, and the importance of a clear message. "Perception," he once told a producer, "is the real product. Everything else is packaging." The global brand, the 2010s opened with a world transformed by technology and globalization, and Donald Trump was quick to adapt. While many business leaders were learning to navigate online branding, he already had one: his name. Trump appeared on towers, hotels, golf resorts, and luxury products across continents. Some he owned, others simply licensed the name, an arrangement that brought steady revenue with minimal risk. To the public, however, ownership hardly mattered. The gold letters alone carried the story. He travelled widely, opening courses in Scotland, hotels in Asia, and developments in the Middle East. Every ribbon cutting became a photo opportunity, every interview a chance to reinforce the mythology of the self-made magnate. Critics called it vanity branding. Admirers called it empire building. Donald called it business. "If you've got a name people recognize," he said in one interview, "you don't need to own every brick, just the reputation, the return of the public voice." As the global brand expanded, so did the stage. Donald had always loved publicity. But now he began using it for more than business. He spoke more frequently about America, its economy, trade, and leadership. Television panels, talk shows, and interviews began inviting him not just as a celebrity, but as a commentator. He had opinions on everything: taxes, wars, markets, presidents. His voice was sharp, confident, and often divisive. Yet even those who disagreed couldn't ignore him. The same directness that once closed real estate deals now cut through political discourse. His style, blunt, unapologetic, self-assured, stood in contrast to the careful language of traditional politicians. Some dismissed it as self-promotion. Others sensed the beginnings of something more deliberate. From showman to spokesman behind the scenes, Donald was observing a shift in the national mood. After years of economic uncertainty and political frustration, many Americans felt alienated from the elite institutions that once inspired trust. He recognized the feeling instinctively, the same divide he'd exploited decades earlier between Queens and Manhattan, between the outsiders and the insiders. He had built his career as the man who refused to bow, who broke into worlds that said no. Now he saw a country full of people who felt the same way. "People want to win again," he told an associate quietly. "They're tired of watching someone else win." The idea grew slowly, almost naturally. What if the man who built towers could now build a message? What if the Apprentice boardroom was only rehearsal for a much larger stage? The decision by 2015. Donald Trump was no longer content being a businessman who commented on politics. He wanted to enter it. The idea, floated publicly many times before, was now real. He met with advisors, pollsters, and friends. Some encouraged him. Others warned that politics would expose him in ways business never had. But Donald had made his decision. He understood risk. He understood spectacle. And perhaps better than anyone else in modern America, he understood that narrative drives power. "The country," he said, "needs the same thing a business does: focus, confidence, and a deal-maker." On June 16, 2015, standing in the atrium of Trump Tower, beneath the mirrored ceilings and cascading escalators, he announced his candidacy for President of the United States. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and his voice echoed through the space he had built decades before. The line between businessman and political figure dissolved in that moment. The stage lights of television had merged with the spotlight of history. For Donald Trump, it was not a reinvention. It was simply the next logical deal. The summer of 2015 changed everything. When Donald Trump descended the golden escalator inside Trump Tower to announce his candidacy for President of the United States, few people took it seriously. Journalists saw a publicity stunt. Political strategists dismissed it as another branding exercise. Even longtime allies thought it was just another headline in a long line of headlines. But to Donald, it wasn't theatre. It was opportunity. He had spent his entire life turning underestimation into advantage. Every "he can't" had become a challenge. This time would be no different. "America doesn't win anymore," he declared that day. "We're going to make America great again." The phrase, simple and rhythmic, caught fire. Within weeks, "Make America Great Again" was not just a slogan. It was a movement, the unlikely candidate. Trump's campaign broke every political rule. He had no prior experience in government, no polished team of advisors, no scripted speeches. Instead, he relied on instinct, energy, and constant presence. While other candidates delivered careful policy proposals, he spoke directly, often bluntly, sometimes controversially, about trade, immigration, and jobs. The establishment recoiled, but millions of Americans, tired of political caution, heard something familiar, a voice that sounded unfiltered. His rallies grew larger with each state. They were part campaign, part performance, blending humor, grievance, and bravado in equal measure. Critics called it demagoguery. Supporters called it authenticity. For Trump, the distinction didn't matter. He measured success by attention, and attention he had in abundance. Cable networks, unable to look away, broadcast his speeches live, giving him billions of dollars in free coverage. Every headline, even negative ones, expanded his reach. "There's no such thing as bad press," he once told a journalist. "Only bad timing." The shockwaves of 2016, by the start of 2016, what had begun as a long-shot campaign, had turned into a political earthquake. Trump defeated well-funded rivals one by one in the Republican primaries. His rallies filled stadiums. His quotes dominated every news cycle. He called out the media, mocked opponents, and broke with decades of political etiquette. Yet nothing seemed to hurt him. Every controversy only amplified his visibility. In July, he officially became the Republican nominee for president, standing on stage with his family, promising to bring back jobs, borders, and pride. For his supporters, he represented rebellion against the political class. For his opponents, he symbolized division and unpredictability. The race against Hillary Clinton became one of the most polarizing contests in American history. Analysts, pollsters, and late-night hosts predicted his defeat. But Donald, ever the tactician, ignored the noise. He campaigned relentlessly across the Midwest and South, focusing on disaffected voters who felt left behind by globalization. "The forgotten men and women of our country," he said, "will be forgotten no longer." It was both promise and strategy, a connection built not on policy detail, but on emotion. Election night on November 8, 2016, the world watched as results began to roll in. At first, it seemed impossible, but state by state, the map turned red: Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Each win chipped away at the disbelief. By midnight, it was clear. Donald J. Trump, businessman and television star, had been elected the 45th President of the United States. In the ballroom of the Hilton Hotel in New York, he took the stage as chants of USA filled the room. For a moment, the man who had built towers and casinos, who had lost fortunes and rebuilt them, simply stood there, silent, almost contemplative. Then he spoke. "It's time for us to come together as one united people. I will be president for all Americans." Outside, the country was divided. Jubilation in some streets, disbelief in others. But for Donald, it was another deal closed, another unlikely ascent achieved. He had done what few believed possible, turned celebrity into legitimacy, brand into presidency. The transition, in the months that followed, he assembled a cabinet of business leaders, generals, and loyalists. He entered the White House not as a politician, but as a negotiator. "I'm not here to play by Washington's rules," he told his staff. "I'm here to change them." The tone of American politics began to shift almost immediately. Tweets replaced press releases. Rallies continued even after the election. The line between campaigning and governing blurred. To supporters, he was breaking the mold, a businessman bringing decisiveness to a stagnant system. To critics, he was dismantling norms essential to democracy. But for Donald Trump, every criticism was confirmation that he still controlled the conversation. He had once said that business was war, and now politics was simply a new battlefield. The inauguration of Donald J. Trump on January 20th, 2017 marked a moment unlike any other in recent memory. The skyline of Washington was grey, the air sharp with winter. Supporters packed the National Mall waving red banners, while protesters filled nearby streets. America, as he took the oath, was already split. Two visions of the same country facing each other across a widening divide. Standing at the podium, he declared in his signature cadence, "From this day forward, it's going to be only America first." It was both promise and provocation. For Donald Trump, the presidency was never going to be a quiet chapter. He approached it the same way he approached business, with instinct, spectacle, and a belief that disruption was proof of progress. The business of governing from the beginning, his style clashed with Washington tradition. He preferred action to deliberation, personal loyalty to hierarchy, and social media to press briefings. Twitter became his direct line to the public, unfiltered, impulsive, and relentless. Supporters praised his candor. Critics saw chaos. His policies mirrored his campaign. Tax cuts, deregulation, stricter immigration controls, and a push to renegotiate international trade deals. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, reworked NAFTA into the USMCA, and imposed tariffs on China, declaring that unfair trade had cost America too much. Foreign leaders, uncertain at first, learned that Trump's unpredictability was not a tactic, it was a method. He met with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, walked across the demilitarized zone, and touted it as proof that unconventional diplomacy could work. At home, the economy surged. Stock markets reached record highs, unemployment fell to its lowest in decades, and his base of supporters remained fiercely loyal. Yet the controversies were constant. Investigations, accusations, leaks, and protests. In the White House, he thrived on conflict. Without pressure, he once said, nothing moves. Storms and survival, the year 2019 brought impeachment, not once, but twice before his political life was over. The first came over allegations of abuse of power related to Ukraine. The second, after the 2020 election and the storming of the Capitol. Both times, he survived, acquitted by the Senate. To his opponents, it was proof of partisan paralysis. To his followers, it was evidence of persecution and endurance. His presidency had become a mirror in which the country saw its divisions reflected back at itself. Every tweet, every policy, every rally drew both adoration and outrage. The line between politics and identity blurred further. And yet, even as institutions strained under the tension, Trump remained certain. He measured his presidency not by approval ratings, but by dominance of attention. "You have to be the story," he had once said as a businessman. In Washington, he made sure he still was. The pandemic and the election, then came 2020. A new virus spread across the world, bringing economies to a standstill and fear into every household. The pandemic tested every government, and Donald Trump's administration was no exception. He imposed travel bans, mobilized private industry to produce ventilators, and oversaw the rapid development of vaccines. But his public handling, often blunt, sometimes dismissive, polarized the nation even further. As the election approached, the country was exhausted by lockdowns, by politics, by constant noise. Still, Trump campaigned relentlessly, holding rallies across battleground states, insisting that the American spirit was unbreakable. His opponent, Joe Biden, promised stability and empathy, the opposite of Trump's firebrand energy. On election night in November 2020, the results unfolded slowly. Mail-in ballots surged because of the pandemic. In the early hours, Trump appeared ahead. By morning, the tide had turned. When the networks declared Biden the winner, Trump refused to concede. He claimed the election had been stolen, launching lawsuits and rallies that kept his supporters energized and his critics alarmed. The Capitol and the aftermath on January 6, 2021, as Congress met to certify the results, thousands of his supporters gathered in Washington. What followed would mark one of the darkest days in modern American politics. A mob breached the U.S. Capitol, clashing with police, halting the certification process. Trump's critics blamed his rhetoric. His defenders pointed to deeper unrest across the nation. Within days, he was impeached again, this time for incitement of insurrection. The Senate acquitted him after he had already left office. When he boarded Marine One for the last time as president, he left Washington defiant but unbroken. "We will be back in some form," he told his supporters. Legacy and reflection. Outside the presidency, Donald Trump remained what he had always been, a man who refused to vanish. He continued to hold rallies, build a media presence, and shape the political movement that bore his name. To millions, he remained a champion of disruption. To others, a symbol of division. Yet, whether admired or despised, he had done what few in history ever managed. He had redefined the boundaries between business, celebrity, and politics. He had built towers, survived bankruptcy, conquered television, and won the highest office in the land, all while remaining unmistakably himself. Standing once again at Mar-a-Lago, his Florida estate, he looked out over the Atlantic. The sea glittered beneath the afternoon sun, endless and uncertain. To most, it looked like retirement. To Donald, it looked like another horizon. The future, he said quietly to an aide, is always negotiable. And with that, the man who had spent his life making deals, with bankers, with networks, with nations, began plotting once more. Because for Donald Trump, the story was never about what he had achieved. It was about what came next.